Good evening, and thank you all for joining us for this special Juneteenth program. I'm Randy McKenney, Board President of the Windsor Historical Society. For those who do not know, Juneteenth's origins are in the Civil War. When President Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, he established that all enslaved people in Confederate states in rebellion against the Union shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. It is important to note that this only applied to former Confederate states. There were still legally enslaved people in the United States that never seceded from the Union. They would not be free until the ratification of the 13th Amendment almost 3 years later. And there were also places in the Confederacy where the Emancipation Proclamation could not be implemented because they were still under Confederate control. This included Texas. Freedom finally came to Texas on June 19, 1865, when 2,000 Union troops arrived in Galveston Bay. The Army announced that more than 250,000 enslaved individuals in the state were free and enforced the decree. This day came to be known as Juneteenth by the newly freed people of Texas. Juneteenth was marked with celebrations among the black communities in Texas for years to come. Over the decades, it spread from its home state and began to take on a larger cultural context, representing the celebration of the end of slavery, not just in Texas, but for all. Over 150 years later, following many efforts to establish the second Independence Day, Juneteenth was finally declared a federal holiday in 2021. On this spot, we remember the names of Jack Japhet Pell, Sarah, her daughter Elizabeth Betty Stevenson, and Nancy Toney. These are the names of the people that we know lived and worked in the two Chaffee houses on either side of us. There is so much that we will never know about their daily lives, but we can say with certainty that they walked regularly across this yard, that on occasion they would have worked here, doing laundry, prepping food, or a dozen other tasks, while sharing stories and words of support. It is in their honor and the memory of the thousands like them here in Connecticut that we ask you to commemorate Juneteenth with us. Today we will read the words of their contemporary, Lemuel Haynes. I would like to now introduce my colleague Dan, who will tell you a little bit about Haynes before our reading. Thank you.
Lemuel Haynes was the first black ordained Protestant minister in America. Born July 18, 1753 in West Hartford, Connecticut, in case you were wondering. His sermon, Liberty Further Extended, or The Free Thoughts on the Illegality of Slave Keeping, is an anti-slavery sermon written in 1776. Instead of basing it on biblical passages as most sermons, Haynes instead placed his text on the now familiar excerpt of the Declaration of Independence. And as a sermon, it details a critical examination of words and ideas connected to this particular text. That excerpt being, we hold this truth to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The text that we're going to read tonight was written by Haynes when he was only 23 years old. He was a Minuteman, having fought in the Revolution, right? Absorbed the revolutionary fervor and the ideology of colonial independence, right? A lot of people are talking about independence. What does this mean? He was also an abolitionist. With this sermon, he exposes the hypocrisy of America, demanding freedom from Britain while at the same time enslaving people. He uses both the languages of the Bible and Declaration, as I've already stated, to argue that liberty is an unalienable God-given right, regardless of race, and that bringing the kingdom of God to America will require the emancipation of the Africans. This is one of the first earliest known writings by an African American that links anti-slavery with the ideas of the American independence. Haynes's writing is an important addition to the early anti-slavery literature of the American colonies, It was only identified and published recently, in 1983, so about 42 years ago, right? 43 years ago. It is uniquely situated at the crossroads of independence, anti-slavery, congregationalism, and black identity. So, as we're moving forward, oh my God, I got pages up here tonight, let me tell you.
Thanks, Dad.
Our reading, as we go forward, was divided into 18 parts. Okay, so if you're looking at your copy, there's a number. It might say reader 1 at the top, or there might be a page number at the top. That's how you know what number you are. You're going to see me put up a number 1 in number 2, reader number 2, be ready. When I get through about halfway through this reading, I'll be following along with them. I'll change for that person. These 2 chairs that you see next to this desk will have one person reading, people waiting to go up. So we'll have a smoothly transition, one person after the other as we get through the different sections. We do have plenty of, well, this reads that we have plenty of cold drinks and bug spray, which we do not have. But we do have air conditioning and restrooms available at the museum across the street. For readers, please feel free to read with much as feeling and expression as you like. If you encounter a name or word which you are not familiar, please pronounce it as best as you can, and just feel comfortable. Because most people don't remember to hold the mic when they're talking, I'll probably be standing next to you to hold the mic so you're heard. Without further ado, I am very pleased and pleasantly happy. Someone would say hippopotamus proud, right? And crocodile glad to introduce my friend, Versatile Poetic, who is a very noted local and regional poet, artist. And to be active in the Connecticut art scene, literature scene, is to have heard and experienced Versatile Poetic. She's a published author. Her works have been published in very, very notable, what do you call them, journals and magazines, literary journals and magazines. I've known her for almost 20 years at this point. So I am very happy to, and this is also our first year having a celebrity reader. So, our first celebrity reader, without further ado, Versatile Poetic. Thank you.
Yeah, readers number 2 and 3, sit on deck.
Okay, you're reader 2, reader 3. Yep.
Hello, beautiful people. My name is Versatile Poetic. I'm the inaugural Poet Laureate of the town of Windsor for the past year and a half. It's a 3-year gig. Thank you so much. I have an open mic next Thursday. It's the 4th Thursday of every month at the Windsor Art Center from 6 to 8 p.m. Please come and join me. Before I read for you, I'd like to kick this off with a self-affirmation, which is for you and the ancestors, because that's why we are here. Happy Juneteenth. How it works, some of you already know, some don't. It is 4 snaps. It is 4 pats. It is 4 claps. When you wake up in the morning after you're done brushing your teeth, don't forget your self-affirmation. Please join me. Give yourself some snaps, some pats, and some claps. You're beautiful. You're beautiful. You're handsome. You're worthy. You're enough. You matter. You're the sugar honey iced tea. Don't forget your self-affirmation. Give yourself some snaps, some pats, and some claps. Thank you very much. Liberty further extended. Let's see what we got. As tyranny had its origin from the infernal regions, so it is the duty and honor of every son of freedom to repel tyranny's first motions. But while we are engaged in the important struggle, it cannot be thought impertinent for us to turn one eye into our own breasts for a little moment and see whether through some inadvertency or a self-contracted spirit, we do not find the monster lurking in our own bosom, that now, while we are inspired with so noble a spirit and becoming zeal, we may be disposed to tear tyranny from us. If the following would produce such an effort, the author should rejoice. But to proceed, liberty and freedom is an innate principle which is unmovable, placed in the human species, and to see a man aspire after it is not enigmatical, seeing he acts no ways incompatible with his own nature. Consequently, he that would infringe upon a man's liberty may reasonably expect to meet with opposition, seeing the defendant cannot comply to non-resistance unless he counteracts the very laws of nature. Liberty is a jewel which was handed down to a man from the cabinet of heaven and is contemporary with its existence. And as it proceeds from the supreme legislature of the universe, so it is he which hath a sole right to take away. Therefore, he that would take away a man's liberty assumes a prerogative that belongs to another and acts of his own domain. One man may boast a superiority above another in point of natural privilege, yet if he can produce no convincing arguments in vindication of this preeminence, his hypothesis is to be suspected. To affirm that an Englishman has a right to his liberty is a truth which has been so clearly evinced, especially of late, that to spend time in illustrating this would be superfluous. But I query whether liberty is so contracted a principle as to be confined to any nation under heaven. Nay, I think it not hyperbolical to affirm that even an African has equally as a good right to his liberty in common with Englishmen.
I know that those that are concerned in the slave trade do pretend to bring arguments in vindication of their practice. Yet if we give them a candid examination, we shall find them to be essentially deficient. We live in a day wherein liberty and freedom is the subject of many millions' concern, and the important struggle hath already caused great effusion of blood. Men seem to manifest the most sanguine resolution not to let their natural rights go. A resolution, one would think, everyone that has the least love to his country or future posterity would fully confide in. Yet, while we are so zealous to maintain and foster our own invaded rights, it cannot be thought impertinent for us candidly to reflect on our own conduct. I doubt not but that we shall find that subsisting in the midst of us that may with propriety be styled oppression, nay, much greater oppression than that which Englishmen seem so much to spurn at. I mean an oppression which they themselves impose on others. It is not my business to inquire into every particular practice in this land that may come under this odious character, but that I have in view and humbly offer some free thoughts on the practice of slave keeping. Oppression is not spoken of nor ranked in the sacred oracles among the least of those sins that are the procuring cause of those signal judgments which God is pleased to bring upon the children of men. Therefore, let us attend. I mean to write with freedom, yet with the greatest submission. The main proposition, which I intend for some brief illustration, is this. An African has an undeniable right to his liberty. Consequently, the practice of slave keeping, which so much abounds in this land, is illicit.
Every privilege that mankind enjoy have their origin from God. Whatever acts are passed in any earthly court which are derogatory to those edicts that are passed in the court of heaven, the act is void. If I have a peculiar privilege granted to me by God, then he that would infringe upon my benefit assumes an unreasonable and tyrannic power. It has pleased God to make of one blood all nations of men for to dwell upon the face of the earth. Acts 17:26 through 23. And as of all of one species, so there are the same laws and aspiring principles placed in all nations, and the effect that these laws will produce are similar to each other. Consequently, we may suppose that what is precious to one man is precious to another, and what is irksome or intolerable to one man is so to another, considered in a law of nature. Therefore, we may reasonably conclude that liberty is equally as precious to a black man as it is to a white one, and bondage equally as intolerable to the one as it is to the other, seeing it affects the law of nature equally as much in the one as it does in the other. But as I observed before, those privileges that are granted to us by the divine being, no one has the least right to take them from us without our consent. And there is not the least precept or practice in the sacred scriptures that constitutes a black man a slave any more than a white man. Shall a man's color be the decisive criteria whereby to judge of his natural rights? Or because a man is not of the same color with his neighbor, shall he be deprived of those things that distinguish him from the beasts of the fields? I would ask, whence is it that an Englishman is so far distinguished from an African in point of natural privilege? Did he receive it in his original constitution, or by some subsequent grant? Or does he boast of some higher descent that gives him this preeminence? For my part, I can find no such revelation. It is lamentable consequence of the fall that mankind has an insatiable thirst after superiority one over another, so that however common or prevalent the practice may be, it does not amount even to a circumstance that the practice is warranted.
God has been pleased to distinguish some men from others as to natural abilities, but not as to natural right, as they came out of his hands. But sometimes men, by the heinous practice, forfeit their liberty into the hands of men by becoming unfit for society. But have the Africans ever as a nation forfeited their liberty in this manner? Whatever individuals have done, yet I believe no such challenge can be made upon them as a body, as there should be some rule whereby to govern the conduct of men, so it is the deity. An interest of the community to form a system of law that is calculated to promote the commercial interest of each other. And so long as it produces so blessed an effect, it should be maintained. But when, instead of contributing to the well-being of the community, it proves baneful to its subjects over whom it extends, then it is high time to call it in question. Should any ask, where shall we find any system of law whereby to regulate our moral conduct? I think there is none so explicit and indefinite as that which was given by the blessed Savior of the world. As you would that men should do unto you, do you even so to them? One would think that the mention of the precept would strike conviction to the heart of these slave traders unless an avaricious disposition govern the laws of humanity. If we strictly adhere to the rule, we shall not impose anything upon others but what we should willingly impose upon us were we in their condition.
I shall now go on to consider the manner in which the slave trade is carried on, by which it will plainly appear that the practice is vile and atrocious, as well as the most inhumane. It is undoubtedly true that those that emigrate slaves from Africa do endeavor to raise mutinies among them in order to procure slaves. Here I would make some extracts from a pamphlet printed in Philadelphia a few years ago, the veracity of which need not be scrupled, seeing it agrees with many other accounts. N. Brew, director of the French factory at Senegal, who lived 27 years in that country, says that the Europeans are far from desiring to act as peacemakers among the Negroes, which would be acting contrary to their interest, since the greater the wars, the more slaves are procured. William Bozeman, factor for the Dutch at Delmina, where he resided 16 years, relates that one of the former commanders hired an army of Negroes of Jaffaria and Cavastaria for a large sum of money to fight the Negroes of Commonary, which occasioned a battle which was more bloody than the wars of the Negroes usually are, and that another commander gave at one time 500 lira and at another time 800 lira to two other Negro nations to induce them to take up arms against their country people. This is confirmed by Barbeau, agent general of the French African Company, who says the Hollanders, a people very zealous for their commerce at the coasts, were very studious to have the war carried on among the blacks to distract, as long as possible, the trade of the other Europeans, and to that effect were very ready to assist upon all occasions the blacks, their allies, that they might beat their enemies, and so the commerce fall into their hands. And one William Smith, who was sent by the African Company to visit their settlements in the year 1726, from the information he received from one who had resided 10 years, and this is a quotation, the discerning natives accounted it their greatest unhappiness that they were ever visited by the Europeans, that we Christians introduced the traffic of slaves, and that before our coming they lived in peace. But say they, it is observable that wherever Christianity comes, there comes with it a sword, a gun, powder, and ball.
and thus it brings shame upon our holy religion and makes the name of Christians sound odious in the ears of the heathen. O Christianity, how art thou disgraced? How art thou reproached by the vicious practices of those upon whom thou dost smile? Let us go on to consider the great hardships and sufferings those slaves are put to in order to be transported into these plantations. There are generally many hundred slaves put on board a vessel, and they are shackled together, 2 by 2, worse than criminals going to the place of execution, and they are crowded together as close as possible and almost naked. Their sufferings are so great, as I have been incredibly informed, that it often carries off 1/3 of them on their passage. Yea, many have put an end to their own lives for the very anguish. And as some have manifested a disposition to rise in their defense, they have been put to the most cruel tortures and deaths as human art could inflict. And oh, the sorrows, the grief, the distress, and anguish which attends them. And not only them, but their friends also in their own country, when they must forever part with each other. What must be the plaintive notes that the tender parents must assume for the loss of their exiled child, or the husband for his departed wife? And how do the cries of their departed friends echo from the watery deep? Do not I really hear the fond mother expressing her sorrows in accents that may well pierce the most abhorrent heart? O my child, why was thy destiny hung on so precarious a thread? Oh, that I were a captive with thee, or for thee, cursed by the day wherein I bore thee, and let that inauspicious night be remembered no more. Come, O King of terrors, dissipate my grief, and send my woes into oblivion.
But I need not stand painting the dreary scene. Let me rather appeal to tender parents. Whether this is exaggerating matters, let me ask them what would be their distress should one of their dearest children be snatched from them in a clandestine manner and carried to Africa or some other foreign land to be under the most abject slavery for life among a strange people. Would it not embitter all your domestic comforts? Would he not be ever upon your mind? Nay, doth not nature even recoil at the reflection? And are there not many ready to say, unless void of natural affections, that it would not fail to bring them down with sorrow to the grave? And surely this has been the awful fate of some of those Negroes that have been brought into these plantations, unless we suppose them to be without natural affections, which is to rank them below the very beasts of the field. Oh, what an immense deal of African blood hath been shed by the inhuman cruelty of Englishmen that reside in a Christian land, they being the fomenters of those wars that is absolutely necessary in order to carry on this cursed trade, and in their immigration into these colonies, and by their merciless masters in some parts at least. Oh, yea, that made yourselves drunk with human blood. Although you may go with impunity here in this life, yet God will hear the cries of that innocent blood, which cries from the sea and from the ground against you, like the blood of Abel, more baleful than thunder. Vengeance, vengeance. What will you do in that day when God shall make inquisition for blood? He will make you drink the phials of his indignation, which like a potable stream shall be poured out without the least mixture of mercy. Believe it, sirs. There shall not a drop of blood which you have spilt unjustly be lost in forgetfulness, but it shall bleed afresh and testify against you in the day when God shall deal with sinners.
We know that under the Levitical economy, man-stealing was to be punished with death. So we esteem those that steal any of our earthly commodity, guilty of every very heinous crime. What then must be an adequate punishment to be inflicted on those that steal men? Men were made for those noble ends than to be drove to market like sheep and oxen. Our being Christian does not give us the least liberty to trample on heathen, nor does it give us the least superiority over them. And not only are they guilty of man-stealing that are the immediate actors in this trade, but those in these colonies that buy them at their hands are far from being guiltless. For when they saw the thief, they consented with him. If men would forbear to buy slaves off the hands of the slave merchants, then the trade would of necessity cease. If I buy a man, whether I am told he was stole or not, yet I have no right to enslave him, because he is a human being. And the immutable laws of God and inalienable laws of nature pronounced him free. Is it not exceeding strange that mankind should become such mere vassal to their own carnal avarice, and even to stain their hands in innocent blood, and to bring such intolerable oppressions upon others that were they themselves to feel them, perhaps they would esteem death preferable? Pray consider the miseries of a slave being under the absolute control of another, subject to continual embarrassments, fatigues, and corrections at the will of a master. It is as much impossible for us to bring a man heartily to acquiesce in a passive obedience in this case, as it would be to stop a man's breath and yet have it cause no convulsion in nature.
Those Negroes among us that have children, their children are brought up under partial discipline, their white masters having little or no affection for them, so we may suppose that the abuses they receive from the hands of their masters are often considerable. Their parents are placed in such a situation as not being able to perform the relative duties. Such are those restrictions they are kept under by their taskmasters, that they are rendered incapable of performing those moral duties either to God or man that are inevitably binding to all the human race. How often they are separated from each other, here in this land at many hundreds of miles distance, children from parents, parents from children, husbands from wives, and wives from husbands. Those who God hath joined together and pronounced one flesh, man assumes a prerogative put asunder. What can be done for their condition? In short, if I may so speak, 'tis hell upon earth, and all this for filthy lucre's sake. Be astonished, O you heavens, at this. I believe it would be much better for these colonies if there never was a slave brought to this land, and thereby our poor are put to great extremities by reason of the plentifulness of labor, which otherwise would fall into their hands.
I shall now go on to take under consideration some of those arguments which those that are concerned in the slave trade do use in vindication of their practice, which arguments I shall endeavor to show are lame and defective. The first argument that I shall take notice of is this, that in all probability the Negroes are of Canaan's posterity, which were destined by the Almighty to slavery. Therefore the practice is warrantable. To which I answer, whether the Negroes are of Canaan's posterity or not, perhaps is not known by any mortal under heaven. But allowing they were actually of Canaan's posterity, we have no reason to think that this curse lasted any longer than the coming of Christ. When that Son of Righteousness arose, this wall of partition was broken down. Under the law, there were many external ceremonies that were typical of spiritual things, or which shadowed forth the purity and the perfection of the gospel, as corporeal blemishes, spurious birth, flagitious practices, debarred them from the congregation of the Lord, thereby showing the intrinsic purity of heart that a concealed gospel required as a prerequisite for heaven. And as Ham uncovered his father's nakedness, that is, did not endeavor to conceal it, but gazed perhaps with a lascivious eye, which was repugnant to the law, which was afterwards given to the children of Israel. So it was necessary that God should manifest his signal disapprobation of this heinous sin, by making him and his posterity a public example to the world, that thereby they might be set apart and be separated from the people of God as unclean.
We find it was a privilege granted to God's people of old, that they might enslave the heathen and the stranger in the land, thereby to show the superior privileges God's people enjoyed above the rest of the world. So that today's Gentiles were then subject to slavery, being then heathen. So that if we keep close to the letter, Gentiles must still be subject to the yoke, unless we suppose them free by being brought into the same place, or having the same privileges with the Jews. Then it follows that we may enslave all nations, be they white or black, that are heathens. We find under that dispensation God declaring that he would visit the iniquity of the fathers upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. And we find it so in the case Ham, as well as many others, their posterity being extrinsically unclean. But now our glorious high priest hath visibly appeared in the flesh, and hath established a more glorious economy. He hath not only visibly broken down that wall of partition that interposed between the offended majesty of heaven and rebellious sinners, and removed those tedious forms under the law, which savored so much of servitude, and which could never make the comers thereunto perfect, by rendering them obsolete. He has removed those many embarrassments and distinctions that they were incident to, under so contracted a dispensation, so that whatever bodily imperfections or whatever birth we sustain, it does not in the least debar us from gospel privileges, or whatever heinous practice any may be guilty of. Yet if they manifest a gospel repentance, we have no right to debar them from our communion. And it is plain beyond all doubt that at the coming of Christ, this curse that was upon Canaan was taken off. And I think there is not the least force in this argument than there would be to argue that an imperfect contexture of parts or base birth should deprive any from gospel privileges or bring up any of those antiquated ceremonies from oblivion and reduce them into practice.
But you will say that slave keeping was practiced even under the gospel. For we find Paul and the other apostles exhorting servants to be obedient to their masters. To which I reply that it might be they were speaking to servants in minority in general, but doubtless it was practiced in the days of the apostles, from what St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 21, Art thou called being a servant? Care not for it, but if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. So that the apostle seems to recommend freedom, if attainable. Quoted, if it is thy unhappy lot to be a slave, yet if thou art spiritually free, let the former appear so minute a thing when compared with the latter that it is comparatively unworthy of notice. Yet since freedom is so excellent a jewel, which none have a right to extirpate, and if there is any hope of attaining it, use all lawful measures for that purpose. So that however extant or prevalent it might be in that or this age, yet it does not in the least reverse the unchangeable laws of God or of nature, or make that become lawful which is in itself unlawful. Neither is it strange, if we consider the moral depravity of man's nature throughout all ages of the world, that mankind should deviate from the unerring rules of heaven.
But again, another argument which some use to maintain their intolerable oppression upon others is that those Negroes that are brought into these plantations are generally prisoners, taken in their wars, and would otherwise fall a sacrifice to the resentment of their own people. But this argument, I think, is plainly confuted by the preceded account which Mr. Bozeman gives, as well as many others. Again, some say they came honestly by their slaves because they bought them of their parents for Africa and rewarded them well for them. But without doubt this is, for the most part, false. But allowing they did actually buy them off their parents, yet I query whether parents have any right to sell their children for slaves. If parents have a right to be free, then it follows that their children have equally as good a right to their freedom. So, to use the words of a learned writer, one has nobody to blame but himself in case he shall find himself deprived of a man whom he thought by buying for a price he had made his own. For he dealt in a trade which was illicit and was prohibited by the most obvious dictates of humanity. For these reasons, every one of those unfortunate men who are pretended to be slaves has a right to be declared free, for he never lost his liberty. He could not lose it. His prince had no power to dispose of him. Of course, the sale was void.
But I shall take notice of one more argument which those slave traders use, and it is this: that those slaves that are brought out of a land of darkness under the meridian light of the gospel, and so it is a great blessing instead of a curse. But I would ask, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without knowledge? Let us attend to the great apostle speaking to us in Romans 3:8, where he reproves some slanderers who told it as a maxim preached by the apostles, that they said, quote, "Let us do evil that good may come," whose damnation the inspired penman pronounces with an emphasis to be just. And again, chapter 6, verse 1, where by way of interrogation he asks, Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? The answer is obvious, God forbid. But that those slave merchants that trade upon the coast of Africa do not aim at the spiritual good of their slaves is evident by their behavior towards them. If they had their spiritual good at heart, we should expect that those slave merchants that trade upon their coasts would, instead of causing quarreling and bloodshed among them, which is repugnant to Christianity and below the character of humanity, be considerate to the exemplary among them, that by their wholesome conduct those heathen may be induced to entertain high and admiring thoughts of our holy religion. Those slaves in these colonies are generally kept under the greatest ignorance and blindness, and they are scarcely ever told by their white masters whether there is a supreme being that governs the universe, or whether there is any reward or punishments beyond the grave. Nay, such are those restrictions that they are kept, that they are scarcely known that they have a right to be free. Or if they do, they are not allowed to speak in their defense. Therefore, they are styled the ignorant part of the world. Whereas under the same advantages to get knowledge, perhaps their progress in arts would not be inferior. Should we give ourselves the trouble to inquire into the grand motive that indulges men to conceal themselves in a trade so vile and abandoned, we shall find it to be this: to stimulate their carnal greed, and to maintain men in pride, luxury, and idleness. How much hath it subserved to this vile purpose, I leave the candid public to judge.
But although God is of long patience, it does not last always. Nay, he has whet his glittering sword, and his hand hath already taken hold on judgment. For who knows how far that the unjust oppression that hath abounded in this land may be procuring cause of this very judgment that now impends, which so much portends slavery. For this is God's way of working. Often he brings the same judgments or evils upon men as they unrighteously bring upon others, as is plain from Judges 1. But Adoni-Bezek fled, and they pursued after him and caught him and cut off his thumb and his great toes. And Adoni-Bezek said, 70 kings, having their thumbs and their great toes cut off, gathered their meat under my table. As I have done, so God hath requited me. Again, Revelations 16, verse 6. For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy. And chapter 18, verse 6. Reward her even as she rewarded you. I say this is often God's way of dealing, by retaliating back upon men the same evils that they unjustly bring upon others. I don't say that we have reason to think that oppression is the alone cause of this judgment that God is pleased to bring upon this land. Nay, but we have the greatest reason to think that this is not one of the least. And whatever some may think that I am instigated by a false zeal, and that all that I have said upon the subject is merely novelty, yet I am not afraid to appeal to the conscience of any rational and honest man as to the truth of what I have just hinted at. And if any will not confide in what I have humbly offered, I am persuaded it must be just short-sighted persons whose contracted eyes never penetrate through the narrow confines of self and are mere vassals to filthy lucre.
But I cannot persuade myself to make a period to this small treatise without humbly addressing myself, more particularly unto all such are concerned in the practice of slave-keeping. Sirs, should I pursue the dictates of nature, resulting from a sense of my own inability, I should be far from attempting to form this address. Nevertheless, I think that a mere superficial reflection upon the merits of the cause may serve as an ample apology for this humble attempt. Therefore, hoping you will take it well at my hands, I presume, though with the greatest submission, to crave your attention while I offer you a few words. Perhaps you will think the preceding pages are unworthy of speculation. Well, let that be as it will. I would solicit you seriously to reflect on your conduct, whether you are not guilty of unjust oppression. Can you wash your hands and say, I am clean from the sin? Perhaps you will dare to say it before men, but dare you say it before the tremendous tribunal of that God before whom we must all, in a few precarious moments, appear? Then whatever fair glosses we may have put upon our conduct, that God whose eyes pervade the utmost extent of human thought and surveys with one intuitive view the affairs of men. He will examine into the matter himself and will set everything upon its own basis, and impartially shall be seen flourishing throughout that solemn assembly.
Alas, shall men hazard their precious souls for a little of the transitory things of time? O sirs, let that pity and compassion which is peculiar to mankind, especially to Englishmen, no longer lie dormant in your beasts. Let it run free through disinterested benevolence. Then how would these iron yokes spontaneously fall from the galled necks of the oppressed? And that disparity in point of natural privilege, which is the bane of society, would be cast to the utmost coast of oblivion. If this was the impulsive exercise that animated all your actions, your consciences would be the only standard unto which I need appeal. Think it not uncharitable, not uncensorious, to say that whenever we erect our battery so at it is like to prove a detriment to the interests of any, we lose their attention. Or, if we don't entirely lose that, yet if true Christian candor is wanting, we cannot be in a suitable frame for speculation, so that the good effect that these otherwise might have will prove abortive. If I could once persuade you to reflect upon the matter with a single and impartial eye, I am utmost assured that no more need to be said upon the subject. Whether I be so happy as to persuade you to cherish such an exercise, I know not. Yet I think it is very obvious from what I have humbly offered that so far forth as you have been concerned in the slave trade, so far it is that you have assumed an oppressive and tyrannic power. Therefore, is it not high time to undo these heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free?
Pray, let there be congruity amidst your conduct, lest you fall amongst the class the inspired penman speaks of. Romans chapter 2, verse 21. Thou, therefore, which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself. Though that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Though that saith a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Though that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Though that makest thy boast of the law, though by breaking the law dishonorest God, while you though sway your tyrant scepter over others, you have nothing to expect but to share in the bitter pill. 'Twas an excellent note that I lately read in a modern piece, and it was this: oh, when shall America be consistently engaged in the cause of liberty? If you have any love to yourselves, or any love of this land, if you have any love to your fellow man, break those intolerable yokes, and let their names be remembered no more. Let they be retorted on your own necks, and you sink under them. O God, will you not hold you guiltless?
Okay. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. I appreciate you all. Thank you all for coming. I want to leave you with this note. The last few pages of the sermon we just read are missing. While we cannot say for sure what else Haynes would have said as a young man, but we can look to his future for guidance. Okay. 25 years after Haynes wrote Liberty Further Extended, the promise of liberty was still not realized for the 900,000 enslaved people living in the United States. Recognizing that this work was not finished, Haynes wrote another sermon for the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. In it, he continued to make his case that the God of nature did not make Africans inferiors to white. Slavery, therefore, was the creation only of cruel hands of oppression. From this, we can see that Haynes continued to fight for liberty and freedom for all. Thank you all for participating tonight in this commemoration of Juneteenth. I hope you all enjoyed the night.